For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, serving with the 352nd Artillery Regiment, June 6th started as unremarkably as every previous dawn on the Normandy coastline. A damp fog drifted across the English Channel, wrapping the world in monochrome silence. Salt air mingled with the smell of wet soil in the pre-dawn cold. The clock had barely passed 5. Just another shift, another morning of tense anticipation. Yet as he peered through his field glasses while the first pale light struggled against the darkness, the ocean itself began to transform. This wasn't the incoming tide, this wasn't approaching weather. This was something beyond belief. Where water met sky, a dark smudge had materialized, steadily expanding, crystallizing, reproducing itself. This wasn't simply a naval force, this was a metropolis of iron, a floating city emerging from the fog and sailing into the pages of history. In that instant, before any Allied boot touched the sand below, before the world would learn what Omaha or Utah meant, he understood the Reich was finished. To grasp the magnitude of that revelation, you need to understand the psychology of Fortress Europe during the spring of 1944. Stretching from Norway's fjords to the Franco-Spanish frontier, German engineers had constructed the Atlantic Wall. It represented a vision of concrete and iron, armed to the teeth, an unbreachable barrier against any seaborne assault. Within German command circles and throughout the propaganda machinery feeding the troops, it stood as testament to the Reich's invincibility. But Oberleutnant Richter, a career military man who'd survived the Eastern Front, understood how propaganda diverged from truth. At 32, he carried memories of a different Germany while bearing the scars of this war's crucible. He remained pragmatic, perceptive, and bone-weary. Under his authority sat an artillery position equipped with heavy Czech-manufactured guns embedded in reinforced concrete several kilometers inland from what the Allies would designate Omaha. His observation bunker, a fortified structure carved into an elevated headland, offered commanding views of the sea. Every day followed the same pattern for him and his crew. They ran exercises, computed trajectories, serviced their weapons, and watched the endless gray expanse. Conversation always circled back to the invasion, der Tag, the decisive day. When would it arrive, and critically, where would it strike? German intelligence remained convinced the primary assault would target Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest crossing point. Logic dictated this choice. Germany's 15th Army, representing the majority of Wehrmacht forces in France, waited there. Normandy rated as secondary, perhaps suitable for a feint, but never the principal objective. This represented catastrophic strategic misjudgment. Though it wasn't coincidental, it resulted from a masterful Allied deception operation designated Fortitude, leaving Normandy's defenders perilously vulnerable. Richter's formation, the 352nd Infantry Division, outperformed most units in the sector, yet it remained merely a ghost of the elite divisions that had swept through France in 1940. His men combined Eastern Front survivors like himself with predominantly teenage draftees and aging reservists. Courage and discipline they possessed, but they weren't the shock troops of the Blitzkrieg years. They were static defenders stretched impossibly thin along an overextended perimeter. The Atlantic Wall itself resembled patchwork rather than solid fortification. Numerous bunkers remained unfinished. Minefields contained exploitable gaps. The sheer distances meant isolated strongpoints could be surrounded and neutralized. Richter recognized these weaknesses. He'd witnessed the paths local residents continued using, identified the dead zones in overlapping fields of fire. His professional judgment questioned their prospects against a committed offensive. Throughout the weeks preceding June, tension became almost palpable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, charged with strengthening coastal defenses, had worked feverishly. He'd demanded millions of additional mines and thousands of jagged metal obstacles across the beaches. Soldiers nicknamed them Rommel's asparagus. Rommel grasped something Berlin's high command seemingly missed. Unless the Allies were destroyed during their first 24 hours ashore, Germany's western campaign was finished. Allied aviation would devastate any German units attempting to reinforce the coast. Everything hinged on that opening day. Yet June 5th brought deteriorating conditions. Strong winds and rough waters accompanied the storm. German meteorological services confidently projected invasion conditions would remain impossible for several days. This prediction permitted senior leadership to relax their vigilance. Rommel himself had departed France, returning to Germany for his wife's birthday celebration. The weather guaranteed safety. Therefore, as Richter maintained his watch during the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, the atmosphere remained routine. Though the storm had subsided, the channel remained choppy. Nobody anticipated anything unusual. He was scanning eastward when movement caught his attention. A shimmer. He raised his precision Zeiss optics and adjusted focus. His heartbeat, maintaining the steady rhythm of nocturnal watch duty, suddenly accelerated. This wasn't a shimmer. These were vessels, not reconnaissance, not raiders, hundreds of them, with countless more materializing behind. He panned his binoculars horizontally. Every direction revealed the same sight. The water had ceased being gray ocean. It had become a continuous mass of threatening silhouettes. Cold terror crawled through him. It felt like confronting an impossible equation. For several moments, Richter couldn't process the information. The scale defied rational comprehension. German intelligence had estimated the Allies might assemble perhaps 3,000 ships for an invasion, already representing an extraordinary achievement. What stretched before him transcended those calculations entirely. Attempting to count proved futile. Instinct drove his tactical assessment. He identified the massive profiles of capital ships and heavy cruisers. He observed packs of agile destroyers circling them predatorily. Then came the others, the infinite, innumerable others. Landing vessels of every conceivable design, packed so densely they resembled metal shavings attracted to a magnet. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, looked again. The vision remained unchanged, only sharpening as dawn progressed. The official tally for the complete operation would eventually reach nearly 7,000 ships, representing an international coalition of 8 nations. It stands as history's largest amphibious assault force. But for Richter, these weren't numbers. This represented a tangible presence that seemed to warp the horizon itself. It declared industrial capacity so overwhelming that it rendered his entire understanding of warfare obsolete. Germany had erected walls of concrete. The Allies had constructed a bridge of steel. He seized the field telephone with trembling, sweat-slicked hands. Richter reporting from Observation Post 4, visual confirmation of channel activity, multiple vessels. The responding voice sounded fatigued, unimpressed. We're tracking scattered contacts near Le Havre, probably reconnaissance. Monitor and report. Negative. Richter's voice carried strain and urgency. You misunderstand. Not scattered contacts. Thousands of ships. The entire channel filled horizon to horizon. This is the invasion. Silence followed. Disbelief. Richter could practically hear the recipient imagining him as a panicked junior officer seeing phantoms. Near Le Havre, sea state remains prohibitive. Our analysis contradicts your assessment. Richter shouted, his composure fracturing. I'm observing this directly. In God's name, look at the sea. He slammed down the receiver in frustration. The scale exceeded believability. He tried another connection to regimental command and reached his superior officer. "Richter here, sir. The invasion armada has arrived. 10,000 vessels." He recognized his exaggeration, yet in that moment it seemed understated. The major's response conveyed skepticism. "Richter, you're certain? The weather conditions—" "The weather's clear enough to witness the apocalypse, Major, and it's positioned in the English Channel, requesting authorization to commence fire." This time his urgency penetrated. The command structure was paralyzed by imagination's failure. Their strategies, their charts, their intelligence assessments, all were being invalidated by the reality positioned offshore. While Richter observed the armada, High Command focused on inland paratrooper reports, assuming those represented the main threat. Nobody was watching the ocean. Richter didn't await authorization. He bellowed commands to his crew. Awakened by the commotion, they stared from their positions, expressions mixing wonder and fear. They witnessed what he witnessed. Training exercises had ended. This was combat. Heavy ammunition came up from storage. Rangefinders reported distances that seemed impossibly far. The massive gun barrels, silent for so long, elevated gradually, directing their muzzles toward the impossible fleet. Richter remained at his position, optics pressed against his face. He could observe landing craft assembling. He could sense the vibration in the atmosphere, thousands of engines humming collectively. It was the sound of a superpower inhaling, and he was about to cast the opening stone. Authorization finally arrived shortly before 6 o'clock. "Engage at discretion." For Richter, it brought release. The paralysis of disbelief shattered under action's familiar clarity. "Fire!" he roared through the telephone. Moments later, the earth shook as the first gun discharged. Then another, and another. Shells shrieked across the water. Richter tracked them through his optics, professional satisfaction mixing with dread. He observed water columns erupting throughout the fleet. Misses, repeated misses. His crew was skilled. They corrected their aim, maintaining disciplined firing rhythm. Briefly, they scored hits. Richter witnessed direct strikes on an American destroyer, USS Corey. Orange flame burst forth with black smoke blooming. Though historical accounts suggest mine damage may have contributed, from Richter's vantage, his artillery had drawn first blood as the vessel listed, crippled, and eventually foundered. His men cheered. For several minutes it resembled genuine battle. It felt like their training mattered. But the sensation proved fleeting because after Corey was struck, the fleet neither scattered nor hesitated. The formation's gap simply closed. The unending columns of ships continued advancing, an iron tsunami that couldn't be halted. His guns fired repeatedly, yet for each vessel they might damage, hundreds passed untouched. Richter felt overwhelming futility wash through him. He was one man with a bucket attempting to drain an ocean. He looked beyond his own shell impacts and perceived the larger picture. Allied battleships, vessels like USS Texas, were now rotating their enormous 14-inch guns toward shore. Then came the response. It began as distant thunder across the water. He saw flashes from the capital ships resembling silent electrical storms on the horizon. Seconds later, the surrounding air began tearing itself apart. The ground started convulsing. Earth geysers erupted across the fields. The systematic industrial process of demolishing the Atlantic Wall had commenced. Where was Germany's counterattack? Where were the tanks? Where was the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the skies and saw exclusively Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports. They dominated the air completely. German doctrine prescribed armored counterstrikes. However, the nearest armored formation, the 21st Panzer Division, remained immobilized by confusion and requirements for direct authorization from Hitler's headquarters. When it finally moved, it advanced without air protection into skies black with Allied fighter bombers and was decimated before reaching the front. In that instant, with his own artillery firing and steel raining from above, Richter understood this wasn't combat. This was extermination. The Allies weren't attempting to outflank him, they were attempting to erase him. This singular personal revelation of overwhelming power defined the entire Normandy campaign. The narrative of how industrial supremacy eclipsed battlefield tactics remains complex and compelling. If you find these detailed explorations of history's overlooked perspectives worthwhile, consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the like button. It enables us to keep bringing these essential human stories forward. As naval bombardment intensified, something shifted in Richter's consciousness. His tactical thinking shut down, replaced by cold, horrifying clarity. He no longer saw ships and soldiers, he saw the system powering them, he saw the factories. Through his shaking binoculars, he looked past the warships and visualized the assembly lines of Detroit. He imagined factories producing trucks and engines at scales Germany couldn't approach. The logistics enabling this invasion, sustaining hundreds of thousands of troops on hostile shores, wasn't miraculous. It was simply the product of that industrial output. He examined skies filled with endless streams of C-47 transports and fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew perhaps 300 sorties across all of France. The Allies flew exceeding 14,000. For every German aircraft airborne, over 40 Allied planes operated. The explanation wasn't German courage failing. It was the factories. Then there were the tanks. He knew the German panzer's reputation. Tigers and Panthers were technologically superior, feared by Allied tank crews. But that superiority represented strategic futility. They were complicated, costly, and challenging to manufacture. For every fearsome Tiger rolling off production lines, the Allies were mass-producing dozens of simpler yet devastatingly effective Shermans. Throughout all of 1944, America alone would manufacture over 29,000 tanks. Germany's maximum monthly production never exceeded 2,000. The Allies weren't planning victory through tank quality. They were planning victory by burying the panzers beneath mountains of steel. This was the new reality. This was the industrial mathematics of defeat. All rhetoric about willpower and ideological strength evaporated before these numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined nation could triumph over decadent democracies. But here stood proof that ideology couldn't stop bombers. Willpower couldn't sink battleships. Richter felt profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were competent soldiers. They were about to die, not from being outfought, but from being outnumbered beyond comprehension. They were participants in a contest already concluded. He and his men, the entire German army in the West, resembled a finely crafted blade facing a steam-powered forge hammer. The outcome was predetermined. He thought of propaganda posters and the unshakable belief at home in ultimate victory. It was entirely false. Not merely politically false, but mathematically false. German High Command must have known. They must have examined the production statistics, yet they'd dispatched him and millions of others to fight an unwinnable war. Little wonder that during the war's final year, psychological strain and confrontation with this impossible truth produced rising suicide rates among frontline officers. They weren't simply fighting soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada. They were fighting the full, unleashed power of the global industrial machine. As sunlight climbed, theory became brutal reality. Naval bombardment reached its crescendo, constant rolling thunder that never ceased. The bunker's concrete shuddered, dust cascading from overhead. Through the observation slit, Richter watched the initial landing craft waves strike the shore. Higgins' boats dropped their ramps, releasing American soldiers into the surf. Machine guns in German pillboxes along Omaha Beach opened fire, cutting into the first men reaching shore. From his elevated position, Richter could observe the terrible drama unfolding, water turning crimson, bodies accumulating. The German 352nd Infantry Division was extracting a horrific toll. Momentarily, defenses appeared to hold. Americans were pinned down. But then the industrial equation reasserted itself. Allied destroyers, witnessing the massacre, executed something simultaneously suicidal and heroic. They drove directly toward shore, some approaching within 1,000 yards, hulls scraping sandbars. They directed their guns against German bunkers, providing point-blank fire support in maneuvers that turned the tide at Omaha. Simultaneously, strange new machines appeared. Richter watched amphibious trucks, DUKWs, seemingly drive straight from ocean onto beach. He saw tanks crawling ashore, some equipped with enormous flails to detonate mines. These were Hobart's funnies, specialized armored vehicles the British had developed to overcome precisely these defenses. Germans possessed nothing comparable. The beach scene transformed from struggle into methodical annihilation. German strongpoints were systematically neutralized by naval shells, tank rounds, and aerial bombs. At Omaha Beach alone, estimates suggest the 352nd Division suffered approximately 1,200 casualties that day, a devastating percentage of combat strength eliminated within hours. Richter's own battery had become a priority target. Shells landed progressively closer. Direct hits on gun positions sent fireballs skyward. Another gun was destroyed. Telephone lines went dead. He was isolated, his command shattered. He looked skyward one final time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the initial landing craft wave was being replaced by second and third waves. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently, a conveyor belt of men and materiel that seemed capable of running eternally. The Allies would land approximately 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. The beach battle continued raging, but the outcome had already been determined. It was merely a question of time and tonnage. The Normandy campaign would continue another 2 months. The hedgerow fighting would prove brutal and costly, but would change nothing. Every German tank destroyed represented irreplaceable loss. Every Allied tank lost was replaced by 3 more. Every German soldier who fell created an unfillable gap. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter and thousands of German soldiers who survived that opening day, the war's remainder was merely epilogue. They continued fighting, driven by duty, fear, or patriotism, disconnected from reality. But victory's hope had vanished. It had disappeared in June 6th's dawn light. We often envision the Third Reich's end as gradual, agonizing collapse, culminating in Berlin's battle. But for the Atlantic Wall's defenders, the end arrived in a single horrifying moment of revelation. It was the moment they witnessed a fleet filling the horizon, skies black with enemy aircraft, and a force representing not merely an army, but the full crushing weight of modern industrial civilization. It was a new form of warfare, one not in soldiers' hearts, but on factory assembly lines thousands of miles distant. And for one German officer peering through his binoculars at a sea transformed to steel, it was the morning he knew it was finished.